custos appointed by the Faculty of Education and Culture, I declare this examination and doctoral defense open.
Honorable custos, honorable opponent, colleagues, friends, and family. When my daughter Marina was 10 years old and was finishing the 4th final grade of primary school in Russia, we faced the issue of choosing a new school for the secondary and upper secondary stages. In her old school, graduates' results in national examinations were rather bleak, which also meant bleak perspectives for university education. So I checked school rankings for Moscow, chose 2 schools in our living area that boasted high results in national examinations and subject Olympiads, and we started to prepare for admission tests. Admission to the 5th grade of a prestigious school in Moscow is no joke. One of our chosen schools had a 2-step admission process. First, a written test in mathematics, Russian and English language, and then a test in metacognitive skills. Over 600 children competed, but only about 80 got enrolled. The other school had 3 steps of admission: a written test, an examination in an advanced knowledge of a chosen subject, which was literature, and a trial study week. To prepare for all this, Marina took for half a year a paid-for preparatory course in the first school, and also her grandfather, who is a private tutor in mathematics, gave her some lessons. You can imagine the whole family's joy and relief when she got admitted. Just 30 years ago, when I myself was entering the school, this was unimaginable. A several steps admission and preparatory courses to grade 5, it's ridiculous. To university maybe. There were no school rankings and no national examinations. Every school and university had their own exams. This was a legacy of the Soviet education system, when there was one curriculum and one set of textbooks for all schools. So it was assumed that all schools give more or less the same education. This centralized system was actually dismantled right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Regions were allowed to develop their own curricula, and schools were given the freedom to choose textbooks and teaching methods. After 10 years of this liberalization, coupled with insufficient funding, the state realized that school education became really diverse. The state could no longer claim that it controls the quality of education, so that all citizens can have equal educational opportunities. To re-centralize education and enhance quality control, the state introduced new instruments of governance. There are different ways in which the state can control and manage schools. The traditional way is to issue regulations and then to control by inspections that schools follow their regulations and to demand reports from schools. If the inspector finds that something is wrong, or school reports show it, then authorities take measures. A new way is to measure schools through instruments normally applied in business sector, to define key performance indicators for teachers, school administrators, and schools as units, and to reward and punish school employees financially on the basis of these results. There are also other governance instruments that are considered softer than direct regulations or financial constraints. For example, the state can organize contests and rankings to recognize best schools, or give schools guidelines and training on how to improve. All these newer instruments have something in common. They are all outcome-based. In other words, to make them work, you need to define what are the desired outcomes and how you are going to determine which school is better. A common practice is to measure performance of schools and teachers by the performance of their students in tests and examinations, or in other large-scale studies of student educational achievement. So, about 10 years ago, Russia introduced an outcome-based national curriculum and national school leaving examinations for the first time in its history. Students' results in examinations and educational contests became the main measure of schools and teachers' quality. Salaries and career chances for teachers, and funding and reputation of schools currently depend on their students' results. They also created the ground for school rankings, which parents like me currently consider when choosing a school, and authorities consider when they give grants or look for good practices or for schools needing intervention. This kind of policy is not unique to Russia. On the opposite, Russia followed a global trend when introducing it. Many countries today measure the quality of schools and teachers by their students' results in some kinds of tests. The idea is that test-based evaluation is more impartial and objective than teachers' personal judgments. So it helps everyone, the state, the public, and schools themselves, to better understand what educational outcomes schools produce. Governments use the results of student assessments to monitor the performance of the education system, to ensure that students have met their required educational standards, and to reward and penalize schools for their performance. Teachers and principals use assessment results to adjust classroom practices. Numerical data about student achievement is easy to compare, so cross-national and international tests enable comparisons between schools and between education systems. Publicized results of these tests, for example in form of school rankings, enhance competition between schools, which is supposed to lead to better quality of education. However, critics say that managing schools by comparing their students' results and tests has many negative effects. First, preparing students to the tests becomes more important than teaching the usual education program or doing some extra activities in schools. You can remember your experience with some language test or graduation test that you had to take, and you most probably prepared for the test specifically rather than relied on your general knowledge of the subject. Second, those students who do best in tests mainly come from educated middle-class families, not from poor and uneducated backgrounds. You can guess that after a preparatory course and tutoring from a highly educated grandfather, my daughter was much better prepared for any kinds of tests, not only admission tests, than a child who never had an opportunity for such extra training. So schools try to attract and retain those students who are already well off. And schools and teachers that get students from poor families, or families that don't put emphasis on education, these schools are punished for low performance, while in fact they need extra support from the state. Third, teachers complain about the increased bureaucracy when they need to constantly provide proofs of their good results. They also find competition with other teachers unhelpful in their common work. Overall, both advocates and critics of this test-based policy claim that it had brought about a principally new mode of governing schools. Scholars use expressions such as regime of performativity or post-bureaucratic regime in education. By this they mean that performance indicators became the main instrument of the state, and that mechanisms of quasi-market regulation and self-regulation for schools and teachers became prevailing. At the same time, research in this area mainly examines changes from the top-down perspective. I mean, they look at schools and teachers as objects of the national policy, or victims of the policy if they take a critical stance. My aim was to flip this perspective, to look at the local level, at schools and local authorities as ones who actually make the policy work, or make it not work. In other words, I view teachers and administrators as the agents of any school reform, rather than just its objects. What motivated me to take this perspective? I subscribe to the post-socialist research tradition, which for me is both a methodological and ethical guidance. Soviet political and academic discourses emphasized the role of the state as taking decisions and acting on behalf of people. Also, foreign researchers of socialism often viewed socialist citizens as either fully subdued by the state or actively resisting it. The post-socialist research tradition stems from the research of former socialist countries after they changed their political and economic systems. But gradually, post-socialist research grew to become a specific intellectual tradition, which takes a critical standpoint and calls both socialist and capitalist truths into question. Post-socialist researchers have discovered that what was called socialism and what is now called capitalism is internally diverse, contradictory, and depends in unpredicted ways Everyday actions and decisions of people, even in the time of socialism, in many ways differed from both the official Soviet picture and from its Western representations. The realities that people created locally existed in parallel, changed, and eventually transformed the overall state regime. The so-called transition from socialism to capitalism was also much more complex than predicted by experts, and actions and attitudes of people played major roles in creating this complexity. Researchers within post-socialist tradition make the point that no social system is completely homogeneous or as coherent as the theory suggests. They call for attention to local, micro-scale practices and attitudes and appreciate immersive research techniques. My dissertation research asks two main questions. First, what has really changed for schools with the introduction of new performance-based governance instruments? So can we say that indeed a new mode of governance has emerged? Second, what roles school teachers, administrators, and local educational authorities play in these changes, and how they contribute to the existing governance mode? In order to investigate this from the local perspective, I applied the ethnographic approach. In practice, this means participating in the daily activities of schools for extended periods of time, observing and asking teachers and administrators questions about their everyday work, and collecting multiple types of data in the process of the research. I chose two neighboring schools as my main observation points. One was a recognized best practice in quality assurance and a leader of the regional rankings, and it had a strategic orientation towards high student achievement. The other was chosen as a contrasting case. It aimed, first of all, at creating a supportive atmosphere and retaining students, and occupied a place below the average in regional school rankings. Apart from researching these schools, I attended some local events for schools and interviewed representatives of local educational authorities. So, what have I learned about the effects of the outcome-based quality assurance policy? Has anything changed for Russian schools at the local level? Yes, it has. Effects that I observed in those schools are similar to what is described in the international literature. Since national examinations in Russia bear high stakes for all, for students, for parents, for teachers and principals, for regional authorities, schools work really hard to prepare students to these examinations. They use more tests in order to measure their student preparedness. They have to sacrifice some other educational activities and priorities. Teachers complain about the increased bureaucracy and are stressed when their performance scores are calculated. Does it mean that a new mode of governance in education has arrived, and that performance indicators and competitive education market became the main regulators and drivers for schools and teachers? My conclusion is no, not necessarily. In the locality that I have studied, traditional instruments of governance, such as inspections and reports, are still more important for authorities and for schools. New instruments are added to them. In some cases, they enhance them, but they do not replace them. The actual picture is mixed and uneven, and the implemented quality assurance policy looks differently in different schools. One of the schools that I observed had embraced the policy. It uses performance indicators to stimulate teachers and students, and pays great attention to its place in rankings. The other school implements the new policy only formally, and in reality it retains older practices. For example, it distributes bonus payments to teachers in an egalitarian way, according to their working hours, rather than on the basis of their students' performance. As an administrator from the second school puts it, we retell old stuff in new words, as the authorities want us to. But we will work the same way as we always did. We have multimedia devices now. These are all the real changes. Is there a paradox that despite all the large-scale changes, a given school can still work the same way as they always did? Why wasn't the governance transformed by the new instruments, but they were just added as another layer, sometimes rather thin? We can answer this if we look at the local actors as agents who creatively use the policy to its own ends, or find ways to disregard it. Their decisions depend both on their context and on their management styles and strategic orientations. Administrators at the school oriented at high achievement so publicized results and rankings as a way to stand out in their region and draw additional resources to the school, to attract more academically oriented students and families, hire more teachers and win grants. So in this school, many regarded performance measurements as helpful and contributed to their implementation. The second school, oriented at retaining their diverse student body, viewed comparisons of schools' achievement as pointless and competition as a source of unnecessary stress. For this school, traditional governance instruments that focus on compliance with the law and provision of sufficient inputs are more beneficial than performance-based instruments. To retain students of all levels of achievement and to protect teachers who work with low performers, this school just imitates compliance with the new policy, but emphasizes that it works as it should by the law. For local authorities, it can thus make sense to keep the mixed governance mode, to use both old and new instruments, because it allows them to adjust to the different conditions and interests of their schools. A historical analysis that I also undertake in my dissertation shows that education policy was hardly ever homogeneous, even if you look at the Soviet period, when the system was much more centralized. Behind the official pictures of equal educational provision and consistent state plans, there was internal diversity, competing interests, and unique school projects. Why understanding this diversity is important? Because it has effects both for the local and for the national level. It bears opportunities for change, for taking an alternative course at the level of individuals as well as at the system level. For example, one of my findings was that many teachers did not support the outcome-based policy and valued older practices, including those from Soviet times. This was ignored by national policymakers for about 2 decades. However, a year after my data was collected, in 2016, Russia got a new Minister for Education, who for the first time since 1980s proposed a conservative agenda in education and received a tremendous support from teachers, which allows the minister to carry out this course. I believe that this example of Russia is also relevant outside Russia. It can give hope to those who oppose state reforms, even when these reforms have a long history, or it can present a caution to reform proponents. I ask you, Honorable Dr. Verger, as the opponent appointed by the Faculty of Education and Culture, to present the observations you consider appropriate for this dissertation.
Honorable candidate, Honorable Custos, it's a big pleasure to be here in Tampere today evaluating this PhD thesis because can you hear me? I was saying that it's a big pleasure for me to be here today because, in contrast to this microphone, this thesis is a very strong thesis and very solid. And I want to make clear from the scratch that I really enjoyed reading this thesis dissertation because of the quality of the job that the candidate did, but also because of the relevance of the topic when it comes to the analysis of educational reform, which is a topic I am very much engaged on. So we are in front of a thesis that is talking about a very relevant topic, but also a very complex topic. It's a very complex topic because it's a type of policy that is very difficult to classify. It's a policy that, as is shown very well in the dissertation, is not happening because of a very specific reform agenda, but is being enacted as a layering process of different policy measures that convert different policy instruments in a very effective political device and political instrument that is shaping or trying to shape a school actor's behaviors. And this is why I think it's very brave to do a thesis about an object that is not quiet. It's like alive and evolving constantly. And actually, I don't know if you are familiar with it, but this Monday in the UK there was a big release of a new reform strategy of the quality assurance and evaluation system, because the idea is that to attract teachers and to make the teacher profession more pleasant in the UK. So the UK, that is a system in which has been famous for 30 years of high stakes accountability, a lot of performative pressure, now is somehow trying to revert this pressure on teachers and to reduce the paperwork that quality assurance policies are generating, which is also something that we are watching here. So it's an object that is constantly changing. This is why it's difficult and a challenge to analyze it. It's also a topic, quality assurance and evaluation, accountability, that is very much researched in the Anglo-American world, but is not so well known in other contexts. So I think that now in continental Europe there are more and more research on these models of soft accountability, but we don't know so much about what's happening in the post-Soviet region. And I think that here, again, for this reason is also the candidate's research a very important contribution. The thesis is also very well connected to theories of governance and global governance. And I really like also the idea of addressing this topic from a multi-scalar approach. So it's not only looking at the schools, but also looking at the national regulators, but also how global actors are framing these global agendas. And when it comes to the methodological aspects, I think that the design of the research is very, very strong. It follows a very logical research design, empirical strategy. The research questions are well constructed and well responded by the candidate. And of course, as an evaluator, I also appreciate that the thesis is well written. Actually, I only saw 2 typos in the whole report that are in the same sentence, which is something that I think is very good, because usually it's impossible in such a big work to only. So it's very carefully written, which also shows respect for the audience. I also want to make clear that this is a very individual work that you have done, but it's clearly a work that has benefited from a very vibrant environment that you have in the ethno group, and also in particular with this BRC project that you were a part of. And I remember, I think it was 3 or 2 years ago in CIS conference, the first time I was seeing the members of this project presenting, that I thought that this would be a very promising project. And I think that this dissertation is a very good example of good quality work at both the collective and the individual levels. So just to say something about the object, because as I said, we are in the face of a very live object that can be addressed from very different perspectives. So this first perspective I was referring to is the one on global governance. So how these global agendas are being adopted and recontextualized in different places. This is one of the ways of approaching this topic. Then how are these global agendas regulated at the national and subnational level? What are the particular policy designs? Is another angle to this very complex topic. Then, and I think that this is the focus of the thesis, how are these global agendas and national regulations being enacted, interpreted, and transformed into daily practices by these local actors like schools, teachers, principals, and so on. This is another important angle. Then we have another angle that is the role of intermediate organizations. Could be a school board, but local authorities, inspectors, which is also something that comes in the thesis. And finally, something that is very important for policy purposes specifically, that is not only how these policies are being implemented, but what is the effect of these policies. And I think that here there is a lot of economist of education tradition, a very strong economist of education tradition that is looking at how policies affect learning outcomes. But I think that from a more ethnographic perspective, it's important to do what you do. That is to try to see what are the systemic effects of these policies in the system. And I think that in this thesis you show very clearly how there is an effect of market segmentation or school segmentation because of the enactment of these policies. So you're also looking at the particular effects at the school, but also at the system level. So I think that one of the merits of this thesis is that it is looking at this topic of quality assurance and evaluation from all these different angles, with a focus on enactment, but as I said, doesn't ignore that there are other dimensions to the topic. So, and when a thesis is good, it's very difficult to find criticism, and I think that a very easy way to challenge the candidate is maybe asking or challenging the person for things that didn't do, which is also a very lazy way of evaluating a work, just by highlighting the absences. But to me, there are maybe two things that I would have done if I had to do a thesis like this, just as a way to highlight some particular criticism. And I like the methodology, but I think that I would have emphasized a more realist evaluation methodology. If this is something that you can do in a future paper, for instance, that means that making more explicit what is the theory of change behind these quality assurance and evaluation systems. What are the main premises that these systems want to achieve? What is in the mind of policymakers when they think about and when they write down this type of policy mandates? And I think that in all your different papers, you really show that there is a clear theory of change, that these policies are trying to generate a sort of instructional improvement dynamic in the school. They try to motivate teachers, they try to make teachers to use this data for the school improvement, and then a realist evaluation would try to show how these main premises happen in real situations. And I think that this is something that you really do along the thesis, but maybe in the future you could write one paper from this particular methodology. I think it could be a very interesting contribution because the data is there. It's just a way of framing it differently. And when it comes to highlight another absence, but maybe this is something also for future research, I think that you did a very good selection of school cases, and I think that it's also interesting to look at how accountability pressures and these quality assurance pressures combine with market pressures. And maybe here it would be interesting to look at the schools that are working in different environments, for instance, a rural school without any market pressure and an urban school that is facing these market forces, and see how the accountability system might generate more expressive responses in the absence of market competition, and maybe more instrumental and opportunistic behaviors when is associated to market pressure. So how the same policy can have very different effects according to the context. Maybe, as I said, a PhD thesis like the one we are evaluating here is addressing the topic from very different angles. I am here suggesting just one more possibility that is probably something to take in consideration for future research. And say this, I think that I am ready to start with the exam. Before I start, I would like to ask if it's fine with the custos and with the candidate that we have a more informal interaction and we don't call each other honorable all the time. Because I think that then maybe we can have a more genuine it changed. I would like to organize my questions according to maybe the different angles of your thesis, and maybe I will also, for the sake of time, to group the same questions that are, or the questions that relate to the same topic. So here I would like to start first with this global perspective, and which, as I said, I think that you address your this global perspective of the thesis very, very thoroughly. And maybe the first question that comes to my mind here is whether we are in front, clearly a global phenomenon, a global agenda. But would you say that this expansion of quality assurance and evaluation systems is translating into policy convergence internationally? What does your knowledge about Russia say about this? But also the cases of Brazil and China that you are also familiar with. Sometimes when I was reading paper 2, I had the impression that effectively it looks like these policies are similar in very different countries like Brazil, Russia and China, and that they generate also similar dynamics at the local level. So maybe I get the impression that policy convergence is happening, but what do you have to say? What do you have to say about this? Then, from the global governance perspective, I really like how you refer to the role of international organizations and the World Bank in particular. And maybe I would like you to do a counterfactual reflection of what if the World Bank was not intervening in Russia? Do you think that today you would have a quality assurance and evaluation system, in the sense that maybe you don't need the World Bank to implement these policies, or maybe the World Bank was an important actor, but maybe you also have policy entrepreneurs that are nationally based that also were pushing for this type of agendas? And then a third question on the global governance perspective is whether you would agree with a more historical institutionalist perspective when it comes to consider that there are some administrative regimes that intermediate how these forces, these global forces, global agendas are being implemented. You talk a lot about this post-socialist post-socialist environment, but do you think that post-socialism is in a specific administrative regime, like the Anglo-American regime, the Napoleonic regime we have in the south of Europe? Is it something that is having this mediating effect, this regime? Something similar is happening in other post-socialist countries as what you observed in Russia? So I would like you to reflect also on this idea of post-socialism from the perspective of this historical institutionalist administrative regimes theory.
Thank you for the very interesting questions, and it's really a pleasure to discuss it from this point of view. Regarding the policy convergence and the global agenda, I think that there is a specific agenda that international organizations pursue, and when we look at these different countries like Russia, Brazil, and China, the similarities that we see there can make us make a conclusion that there has been a direct influence from the international level of international organizations on these countries. But if you start from these countries, if you start looking in details about how this adoption or development of specific policies happen, you see that, at least in these countries that we researched in the project, it was very much dependent on the internal national processes and on the agenda of these policy entrepreneurs that you mentioned. That, for example, in in Russia, already in the 90s, before any international organizations entered Russia, there were many discussions about how education could be done differently, what could be done so that schools and teachers would have a bit more opportunities for more individualized teaching, to take better care of the students' interests. It was not connected to any new public management ideas or to any pressures from international organizations, but it was rather an internal concerns about that very centralized system that doesn't let you to adjust teaching to students' needs. And the very liberal law, which was introduced in early 90s in Russia, it opened up opportunities for schools and for local administrations to tailor education to the local needs. And then there were many processes happening at the same time, like a gradual opening of the markets, commercialization of education, the strategies of schools which were underfunded and had to look for opportunities to give resources, financial resources, that some processes started to happen that eventually led to this great internal diversity and the need for the state to somehow regulate it, but policy entrepreneurs and politicians that had influence at that moment, they had great concerns about how we can regulate the system without regulating it too much, without making it the same as in the Soviet Union. So these instruments that they introduced, such as standardized testing and outcome-based curriculum, they were in many ways the results of these national discussions and national concerns. But of course, Russian actors looked at the international agendas, and when international organizations started working with Russian experts, they exchanged a lot of ideas about how things can be done in different ways. So Russian actors welcomed some of these ideas of also accountability, public accountability of schools, rather than accountability to the public rather than to the state. And this is also, this relates to your third question about transformations in post-Soviet, post-socialist region. I don't know much in detail about transformations in other post-socialist countries, but I have the impression that this issue of how to reduce the role of the state and how to keep the balance between strong state, which gives social guarantees, which promotes well-being of all citizens, how you can balance it with the freedom and liberties for individual people, or how you can enable their agency and not make the system over-centralized. So there are similar concerns, and so there are some similar responses to that. But also Russia probably had more potential to form its own agenda and to be independent in its reform, just because it had bigger political weight and more internal resources to pursue its own standing and also do things independently from international organizations and international funding. So then you asked also about the role of the World Bank, and what if it was not there, if it were not intervening. On the one hand, I think that some developments in this direction would still happen. For example, I think that probably the standardized testing would be introduced anyways. There was a very strong national advocates for that, which had political power. And also, I know just a small anecdote about the preparation of these international organizations' reports on Russia, with the recommendations for Russia from international organizations. That when researchers analyze documents and they see this very straightforward links between international documents and national policy documents, they make the assumption that there was a direct influence. But there was an opportunity for for such researcher who were actually working very closely with the World Bank experts and were contributing to this report. And so those national experts said, we were writing the sentences for the international report. So it was the World Bank report, but it was written by the national experts. So it's really difficult to tell what kind of influence and what kind of intervention took place and who was the main interested person there. And specifically for the locality which I studied, it was a region where the World Bank piloted its project, which it funded specifically. And I think that it had a great influence organizationally, just in the ways how this was all introduced, that local specialists received this training from international experts paid by World Bank, that they implemented some processes suggested by the World Bank. But I was in the locality about 10 years later, after the introduction, and it was also it made a very strong impression how much sort of changed back after World Bank left. After the project was over and some specialists pursued careers in Moscow or in other regional centers, and new people came which didn't receive this training from the World Bank, and they had much more traditional ideas about the standardized testing, the instruments of quality assurance, and how you should use them. So it, in a way, it went back to traditional.
I think that your answers demonstrate the importance of a more multi-scalar understanding of this global governance that departs from simplistic assumptions between how the global influences the local, but there is a much more rich and complex interaction between the different scales. So now I have some questions on how this quality assurance and evaluation system has been regulated in Russia, and in other places I have read about or even done research. What we observe is that there are usually some political consensus around the adoption or the importance of adopting these systems, but maybe there are some disagreements on how these systems can be used, and a lot of struggles on whether rankings should be produced or salary bonuses attached to the results of these national assessments. I wanted to ask you whether this is also the case in Russia, that you identify this back and forth dynamics according to different political forces, or even at the local level, that are, as you show very well, key mediators. So it depends on whether it depends on who governs, that the uses of the quality assurance are different or not. And then I have also a methodological question linked to that, because the fact that we are talking about this object that in a way is so messy and so ubiquitous, and is not a very clear object, that is this layering of different instruments coming at the same time, whether you think that this has made your research difficult, and how have you addressed this challenge of trying to observe something that is constantly changing. It was not so clear for me if the quality assurance and evaluation system in Russia does, especially when it reports the results of the school scores, takes into account the social origin of the students, because at some point it looks like the data is published in a very raw way, so you can compare the score of a middle class school with a poor kids a school, which is probably something that is very unfair for those teachers working in schools in more vulnerable context. Is this the case, or was the way the data was published taking into account or trying to correct by this social origin. And then a final question on how these policies are regulated is that accountability and quality assurance, they usually come together with policies of school autonomy. And I think that you clearly show that this was the case, how in the 90s the educational reforms, they also wanted to diversify the educational system, give more pedagogic autonomy to the schools. But of course, then there's usually a tension there. So more accountability and more autonomy. How has this tension been regulated in the Russian context, or whether policymakers see that there is a tension, because maybe they don't see a tension there, and I would like you to reflect also on this.
Well, about this political consensus in the development of the quality assurance policies, I think that, well, I thought about this a lot when I considered these local documents, which tried, they looked as if they tried to incorporate all different political agendas, both things that were important in the past or promoted in the past, such as inputs and social economic status of students, to take into account everything possible, which resulted in such, in more than 80 indicators of quality, which was completely impractical for use, so that authorities still develop their own ideas about which indicators of this 80 are more important. But you could see there already in the process of policy development, probably, as you can guess from the policy document analysis, that they are results of compromises, and as such they already create space for contradictions and for different ways of implementation, because they contain different ideas which are sometimes in conflict. And as the system was being introduced, there was a lot of feedback, a lot of different actors tried to make their point about what is good and what is bad about the system, and I think that maybe not in democratic ways, but in some ways it was taken into account by those who develop policies and those who regulate things locally, so that they changed. For example, in the early period when these national examinations were introduced in Russia, they were also the indicators of the quality of work of the regional governors. So how good your students' results are, indicated how good you are as a governor. So this led very quickly to such fierce competition between regions and such great fabrications and attempts to show better performance, that this was quite quickly abolished, this regulation, and they tried to downgrade the importance of the indicators somewhat. But on the other hand, I think there is this constant tension between the convenience of using such uniformal scale of measuring the quality, measuring the achievement. So it's very convenient for authorities to have some instrument which shows where results are good and where they are bad. So they want to keep it. On the other hand, there are constant criticisms saying that social economic background plays big roles, that you punish wrong people for a good job. So there are these fluctuations which probably depend on personalities locally, how much attention they pay to the school's performance and how actively they use rankings. For example, in Moscow, rankings are very strong. They're very so there are official rankings of schools, and it's not the case for all regions. Also, in the locality that I studied, there was a regional ranking, but then in the process of the research, they stopped doing this ranking. Although they still stayed in the media, so the media tried to continue this work because it was interesting for the parents to use this information for choice of schools. So there's changes in the process of research. Yes, they raised some questions, of course, about which policy I actually research.
Right.
And but I tried to approach it so that I just fixed some date, the year 2015, which policies were there at that time, and just tried to, in the publications already indicate that it's constantly changing, so I'm writing about that period, but currently it might not be completely accurate. Whether social origin of students is it considered in this performance calculations? At the moment it is not considered, and it has never been. It's of course very problematic, and it's very, I think it's very strange that it takes so long time for those who develop these measurements to understand that they need to take this into account. But currently there's quite a strong expert movement. There are many publications, many arguments in public presentations that you need to take into account the social economic context of the school. So maybe they will try to put it in their measurements of performance. And then about the school autonomy, it clearly was a goal in the 90s, but then in the 90s there were no accountability policies. So there was first autonomy and then came accountability. They didn't come as a one block of policies. And this, I'm not sure if it was strongly discussed that as a tension between these two, that when you introduce accountability policies, it reduces the school autonomy. But I think that in the beginning, when the accountability policies were introduced, they were viewed as a probably the only way to regulate autonomous schools without interfering in their autonomy. And there were also some efforts to give schools opportunities to secure this autonomy. For example, there is an official status of an autonomous state school. So you can be a normal public school, it can be an autonomous public school. But then, as again, I know just empirically from what I have heard in the locality from my respondents, the authorities are not happy to let schools gain this status of autonomous. They like to retain control, and also it entails many organizational difficulties for the school. It has to do financial management in different ways, so not all schools want to bother with these difficulties. So the instrument is there, but it's not really used much.
And would you consider, on the basis of your results, that maybe schools, because of this strong accountability system, maybe are becoming more responsible, but maybe less autonomous? And because here I think that sometimes we use the concept of responsibility and autonomy as if they were synonymous, but I think that for school actors it's very difficult to be responsible than to be autonomous, to give the responses that they think are better to educational challenges.
You mean the responsibility to different actors, like to the students, the parents, to the state?
And to the results, to provide with good quality result in these national assessments.
Yeah, I think that because these national examinations are high stakes for students and for families, and they really influence the chances for university education and for the future career. All schools that I have researched and also that I have interacted with, aside from research, they take them seriously and they really want to help students to pass these examinations, irrespectively of the accountability measures tied to these examinations. And with accountability to the authorities, I think schools try to satisfy authorities so that they would not interfere too much, but they feel more responsibility towards students and families and maybe their community rather than to the state. Although sometimes you can hear the phrases like we are civil servants, so we have duties, we have to fulfill the requirements of the state, so we cannot ignore them. We check what the state wants.
Yeah, it makes sense. And yeah, it's a good answer to move to the block of enactment. So how the schools are interpreting this new mandate of quality assurance and external evaluations and transforming it in daily practices. In your dissertation, you refer very much to the fact that some of the responses to these assessments are fabricated, and that teachers, they face a constant compromise or moral choices. And I would like you to elaborate a bit more on that. If you could give some examples coming from your empirical work, and this would be my first question. And the second question on enactment is that you refer to how these material consequences and symbolic consequences of the accountability system, they come together and they reinforce each other. And I find fascinating this debate on what is more important, the material effect or the symbolic effect, because we are also talking about teachers as part of a profession, and for professionals, what is the reputation and the perceptions that society have over their work are very important. So I know that this is again a counterfactual question, because in 2015 at least, the two types of consequences operated at the same time. But if you have to reflect on what is more important for teachers, the reputational side of the implications or the material side, what would you say is more important for Russian teachers?
Probably this aspect of moral compromises and choices that teachers face every day was one of the most problematic effects of this new accountability system in Russian schools. And the examples include the treatment of students, because it has also been noted in other contexts, not only in Russia, that when student performance is high stakes for teachers' salary and career, they might start pay more attention on students whose performance can be quickly improved. And those that do not have such perspectives in teachers' view, they can get neglected. Because it sort of makes no sense to work on this, it's not going to bring more performance scores. And I think that it depended much on the overall strategy of the school. So one school which was more achievement oriented, and it didn't see selectivity practices as problematic. They put the emphasis on the students' work and viewed those whose performance is low as ones who do not want to work, they don't want to contribute, so they are not probably, they do not affiliate with the school culture, so it's probably better for them to find another school with a more flexible culture. So, then teachers would demand hard work from all students, and just push some students sort of off, or like create barriers for them to transfer to the next grade, so, or talk to parents. So there are many informal ways that you can. Officially, schools are not allowed in Russia to get rid of students, but informally there are many ways how you can do it. So they just got rid of low performance. But in the case of other schools, they were really focusing on serving every student, also students who are not going to perform well, and they both viewed it as their social mission for this community, because they were situated in this community which had many poor families. And at the same time, they thought that it's also one of the state priorities that you should work with all students. You should not select with whom you work. It was maybe more diverse among teachers. Some of them would try to gain performance scores, for example, by sending their more better performing students to many different contests to gain the scores. And this would, in some situations, the high achieving student has to participate in so many contests and Olympiads that she or he doesn't have time to really study or to prepare to even to national examinations, for example. So there's again a moral compromise that can be differently treated by the teacher. Also, extra hours. If in one of the schools these extra hours of teaching, of preparing to the tests were paid for, the second school did not offer any paid for courses. So some teachers offered these extra classes for exam preparation, or they would spend more hours with the students who had problems with progressing, and some would not. So this was like individual choice or strategy. And regarding this material or symbolic rewards, which are more important for the teachers who I've seen, well, I would say that first of all, I need to note that the current policy at that time was not completely tied to students' performance. So there was a bulk of salary, and then there was this bonus payment, which you could increase by if your students' results are better. But it's not so that it was maybe not such big difference for teachers. Also, it depended on the school's policies. So the second school tried to distribute salary on the basis of working hours, even though this contradicted the local regulations, so that teachers would not be stressed about this need to boost the performance of their students. Also their salary of teachers is not very high in Russia, and as many teachers said, that I'm not in this profession for the salary. So if I wanted to really get better wages, I would just switch to a different profession, or for example switch to tutoring. But I prefer teaching to tutoring. I prefer working with a group of different students rather than dealing with one or two students. So that's why probably their feeling of professionalism and this recognition of professionalism would be more important to them, and that also the respect with which they were treated by the administration. In one of the schools, it was quite directly tied to their results, and this was stressful for the teachers. But in the other school, the administrators tried to ensure that every teacher feels valued, irrespectively of her students' results. So it's also very much depends on this very micro context of the particular school, I would say. But in general, probably symbolic rewards are still more important.
Yeah, no, fascinating. And one clarification, in the school that is distributing the awards according to results, these results are individual results. What happens with the lecturers that are not part of grades that are being externally evaluated? Is this an issue when it comes to distribute the rewards?
They receive then more administrative responsibilities and get
Okay.
extra payment for that.
Okay, so they compensate in this way. And yeah, I like your response to the material or symbolic effect, because I think there is a big debate on that, and for some analysts, material rewards have an effect in the long run, but in the short term maybe they lose their motivational power, and maybe these reputational symbolic effects, they can have a more permanent impact in the way teachers perform, for the good or for the bad, I assume, according to how they perform, of course, or in which school they are embedded. As part of the enactment, and especially because of the local approach that you adopt in this research, that is also part of this cadet framework that you adopt, I think it's very, very important to take into account the role of local actors, which is something that you do very, very thoroughly. And now I would like to make you some questions on the role of these local actors. So the first question is related to the fact that every time that you introduce a new policy instrument, like in this case, this data gathering instrument and accountability responses, there are new actors, new constituencies that are being generated around them, and you refer to this idea of external commercial providers coming in the educational system or becoming more important in the everyday life of schools. So in which context do you think that these commercial providers have a more intense presence? For instance, do you think that in low-performing schools, do they resort more often to these providers than in well-performing schools, or is the opposite? Well-performing schools go to these providers more often, and this is why they are performing well. So I'd like to see if you identify some varieties of involvement of commercial providers. And then I have two questions on resistance, because I think that your work is also very good at trying to have a more complex understanding of what does it mean, teacher resistance, that is not from open resistance to compliance, 100% compliance with the political mandate. So there are a lot of intermediate responses, and I really like that. But I would also like to know whether you think that resistance is not only mediated by, let's say, the local context, but also by generational aspects. So maybe older teachers are more critical with these systems, but maybe younger generations, they have been socialized in this system, they have been trained according to this new mandate, and for them it's something that is more natural and they don't resist to it. So if you did some observation about it in your fieldwork, and then we tend to think about teachers as usually the most important source of resistance, but what about the families? Is there something like an opt-out movement, as the one that we can see in continental Europe and especially in the US, or in countries with a lot of high stakes accountability system in place? So I would like also to hear more about the role of families when it comes to the resistance perspective.
regarding these commercial providers, which there were several types of them in the locality. One type was this commercial services for testing students, so that they developed examinations similar to national tests, so you could pre-test your students, see their results, and think of how you can improve them before the actual examinations come. And then the other type was paid for contests for teachers or for students, in which there were much higher chances to get good results, and which still brought some extra performance scores to the teachers. And then there are, of course, different tutoring services for the students, which are probably the biggest revenue. But it comes not from schools, but directly from students and their families. So I would say that again, it's maybe a limitation of my research that I have only been to one school, which was high in the ranking and performance oriented, so I might maybe overgeneralize a little bit, judging by this school, about how the logic of this high achievers develops. I'm sure it's not homogeneous also, but at least there was this clear orientation toward achievement, and so they would use all available means to pre-test students more often. Students would more often go to paid for tutoring services offered by the school or offered outside of the school. And this is also a huge source of criticism of all this accountability system, because the critics say that it measures the work of tutors more than the work of teachers. But I think it's all very much dependent, because the achievement-oriented school, which has high results, it attracts families and students and retains families and students who are also achievement-oriented and who are ready to pay extra for this kind of services. And so this all reinforces each other. But not all parents exercise the school choice, and not all of them are ready to pay for extra educational services, and I cannot estimate which percentage of parents is actually active and maybe like me in trying to get best possible education for their kids. But I've seen from the example of the second school that there are large groups of people who are not that attentive to education results. They do not believe maybe in them as good social opportunities. It's just a school, just a place where your children are when you're at work, and that's its main function. And then it doesn't make big difference if the kid goes to work right after grade 9 or goes to upper secondary, and universities maybe not a desired strategy for such family. So they are not interested in extra paid for services. And these schools that work in this environment, they cannot as actively use these kinds of services because parents would not pay for them. And even if the school would try to attract this commercial service and offer them to parents, they would probably not be successful in that. But they probably did not try so hard. They thought that also there was this great difference in understanding of quality by the teachers and schools, actually in both schools, and the state measurement of quality by students' results. So all schools were saying that the quality of education is how well you prepare the child for life, and it's not that consistent with the academic achievements and examination results. So it's also the reason probably why schools would not that actively try to boost results by any means. And regarding resistance, yes, I've seen some effects of the difference of generations of teachers, that the teachers who were trained in the Soviet system, or at least before the introduction of national examinations, they were more critical towards this new system. And the younger teachers who themselves passed national examinations when they were students and then became teachers, they were more ready to accept it. But I think there is also a second explanation towards this difference, which I read from research of United States teachers, and where the researcher found that older teachers, they have more confidence in their own practices, so they are not that, it's not because of the difference of training, they can receive the same kind of training, but with the experience they start to trust more their own judgments and their own methods, and they're not so easily influenced. While younger teachers, they want to learn, they want to get some guidance, so if the state offers this guidance, they are ready to take it. And regarding the families as a source of resistance, I would say that in Russia, in general, it's rather uncommon, and in the locality which I studied, I didn't see parents who would try to resist the accountability system. Probably on the contrary, there were parents who were using it and that were happy to hold schools and teachers accountable and refer to some results or some laws when talking to teachers and demanding better education service to their students. But there are some examples of resistance which I have witnessed in Moscow, and which mainly come from schools with very strong parent community. There are some specific schools with specific pedagogies developed in the 90s, like democratic education or developing students or personal capabilities rather than academic strengths or passing examinations. And they have attracted parents and built a community which supports these values rather than the values of exams or like high results in the formal system. And there were cases when the authorities tried to, or they have actually changed the principle of such school, and the new principal would try to introduce the mechanisms of accountability, but then there was a great resistance from parents who started to sabotage, like their children started to sabotage school. Parents would come to just stay at school during the day, so like there were huge protest actions, and they brought results so that authorities reversed the course, like the new principal resigned and the school was allowed to choose their own candidate, which would work more in line of the school strategy. But these are more like individual examples at the moment.
And more middle class schools.
Probably, or at least, again, maybe it's a legacy of still more unequal but still more egalitarian Soviet society, that education level is not that directly tied to the income level in Russia. So maybe it's more, it's communities of highly educated parents who are not necessarily upper middle class by their salaries.
Right. Yeah, because this quality assurance and evaluation, there is an assumption that the most important mission of schools is to prepare academically successful, they have a high level of achievement, and one of the ways resistance happens is by teachers saying, no, my mission is a different one, I want to prepare kids for life, not only for academic success. And I think that this is also related to one aspect of these quality assurance systems, that they expect that teachers will use this data in their decisions, in their instructional strategies. So do you think that teachers, whether they are young or more experienced, do they need this data to identify those kids that have problems or learning gaps or other aspects that are useful for their daily decisions, or they could really take these decisions without this quantitative data coming from the quality assurance system?
Yeah, I think that the intention of the authorities initially was twofold. One is what you described, to help teachers to identify the level of children and adjust intervention strategies. And the other was the idea that teachers can be unjust and very subjective in the ways they treat students, because also there is a great emphasis on discipline in quite many schools. So children who disrupt discipline, even if they are academically able, they can still receive bad grades from a teacher who doesn't like their behavior. So there was this idea that you empower the kid or her parents, and also you give the proofs to the teacher that it's in studies the student is doing well and has a great potential, and the teacher cannot sort of spoil or ruin the academic career of this child by their biased judgments. So I think that from what I observed, that teachers, at least teachers, think that they have a very good idea about the achievement level of kids in their class. They do use data from tests and from assessments, but not to inform themselves about the abilities of the student, but rather they see the test as a very specific kind of activity, and the ability to pass tests and to perform these test tasks is something very specific, which you cannot maybe see during the normal teaching. If you don't use tests in your teaching, you don't know how stressed this kid will be in the test, or how well the assignment is formulated in the test. Is it understandable to all kids? So by using more tests, they sort of, on the one hand, they help students to get accustomed to this kind of activity, and on the other hand, they see which students have difficulty with this particular kind of activity, and which formulations they don't understand, and they need to be explained more in the classroom. Yes, and for the daily decisions, well, it's hard really to judge the teacher's objectivity or subjectivity towards specific kids. I didn't see any instances that would give me the impression that the teacher really discriminates some child for his or her behavior. And I think that it was probably not as spread as the policymakers insisted that it was. So it
right. Yeah, very good answer. I have also questions on two other types of as actors that are important in accountability regimes. The first one would be local authorities, and of course your research focuses on a particular territory, but I would like to ask you if from your research or the literature review you did, you think that there are varieties of behavior also, not only at the school level, but also at the level of local authorities. So local authorities that are promoting more competitive pressure among the schools, or maybe local authorities that mediate this relationship of accountability in a more constructive pedagogic way. If this is something that you can reflect about, this is something that we have observed in other countries, and I think that in Brazil, for instance, that is part also of the international project you were a part of. It was very different if a municipality was in charge of the Labour Party or it was in charge of a more neoliberal party, the way they interacted with the schools and with the schools principals in particular. So I was wondering whether this is something that happens in Russia. And then the role of inspectors and the more bureaucratic accountability actors. In some countries I have observed, including Spain, inspectors, they feel very disempowered by the new accountability system, because then their judgment is as not important as the judgment is coming from these new data gathering quantitative instruments, and they feel actually that they only deliver the results to the schools, but it's not like they gather the data that is relevant for the evaluation and for the accountability relationship. And you explain very well in your thesis that there is this layering between the bureaucratic and the post-bureaucratic system. Would you consider that there is a trade-off there, or is something that is coupled in a more harmonious way in the case of Russia?
Yes, the local authorities which I interviewed, their representatives, although they're probably the least researched part in my study, just a few of them which I got access to, but they were really very different in their understanding of these instruments and their views of how useful these instruments are and how they can and should be used. And I've seen I think the influence of this World Bank training or the previous training from some Moscow experts, that it influenced the views of people who actually introduced the system and who still are in the system. But as new people flow in without this training, some of them, they don't really see the difference between the new system and the old. For them, there's new data sources. They're just the new kind of statistics, which was always collected by the state. And it doesn't tell, to them it doesn't tell much about the schools, so you have to go and see yourself. Even though there are no inspections as they used to be in forms of when an expert in pedagogy would come and judge how well the lessons are prepared and how well the students answer. But informally they still do the same thing, essentially. They still go to a school to see what's happening, and for them there's results of tests and different kinds of surveys. They just give extra, maybe extra reason to visit the school. but they don't find them as they don't view them as an instrument of governance at all. So it's really interesting, and if you try to, as you said, that in other countries, it's sometimes, like in Brazil, it might depend on the political orientation. Again, it's hard to judge, but it might be so that more conservative and more loyal to the current government, those civil servants would be more prone to use traditional instruments because they are more sort of pro-strong state, and they don't have a problem with extra measures of control for the school, but they use them in old ways, so to say, while the more maybe liberally minded people would think of some more modern, more nuanced ways, and also because these instruments of measurement, they were really new for Russia. They were not like tests of ability or surveys which would incorporate information about students' family or something. They were not in place in the Soviet times. So they were really fascinated by the opportunities which such tests or surveys bring when they were trained to do this. So they maybe even overvalue them. But you could see this maybe waves of more liberal and more authoritarian periods, and from which when the career of the civil servant started would influence how she would understand the purposes and the means of governance. As for inspectors, currently there are formal inspectors that come to schools. They only inspect the documents. They are not interested in pedagogies or in student achievement. They only make sure that the school prepared all the documentation for the law, that the school follows the regulations. And these inspections are high stakes for schools, so they are more high. The stakes are higher than in case of performance, because the school can be closed on the basis of this inspection, but it cannot be closed for low performance. So schools really prepare to them and are happy to pass them. So I didn't have a chance to. This was actually the organization that performs these inspections was the one that neither on the national level nor on the regional or local it was not accessible. We didn't obtain access to it during the project, and I couldn't interview anyone from this organization, and I have no idea about how empowered or disempowered they feel, but I guess they would feel really empowered. And the previous inspectors of pedagogy, they were reorganized and moved to these centers that currently perform assessments and training for the teachers, but they don't do inspections any longer.
Makes a lot of sense. Now you were referring again to the role of the World Bank, and I was wondering whether in Russia today is more important the role of the OECD as a when it comes to policy, borrowing and lending than the World Bank, because I guess that the World Bank had a very important role in the 90s, but I was wondering whether now Russia is resorting more to the OECD than to the World Bank when it comes to search for educational expertise.
Yes, I have the impression that OECD has more influence currently than the World Bank, although both organizations are still present in Russia. But I think that it might be so that the World Bank is viewed as maybe more intrusive or more like having more crude instruments of influence, such as funding.
Right.
And this kind of influence is not allowed in Russia any longer since 2014, I think. But OECD is has more like, softer ways of influence. It just suggests its expertise, and if you want to participate in some of its research, you can, but it's just for you to decide. So they just sort of give you different information and different instruments which you use, not they impose on you. Yeah, and that's why there's still quite intensive interaction, I think, between Russian experts and OECD experts, and some projects going on.
I have a question on, also to start concluding, on methodology, and I think that the methodology that you adopted is the right one for the research questions you had and for the object you had, because we have been talking about this very complex policy that definitely requires of an ethnographic strategy to capture the nuance of actors' interpretation, the influence of particular context, and so on. But if you had to do this research again, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think that when I try to think of what could be done differently in those situations and those conditions and limitations that we had, it's really hard to think of new ways what could have been done. But I feel that this position of local authorities has stayed under-researched, maybe, and maybe I would start early and take more efforts to gain access to more people from local authorities to better understand their position. Not only because I think that would give additional dimension to this research, but I find that in general, it's really under-researched area, because there are quite many studies taken in schools or at the national level especially, but the local authorities, they are, at least in Russia currently, they are constantly reformed. Their roles are discussed. For example, there is now a discussion whether schools should be subordinated to the regional authorities rather than municipal authorities. But nobody really knows what happens there and what influence those local authorities have, what are their bases for decisions. And so it's sort of some under-researched, like black box, which should be understood better.
Would you consider implementing a survey, for instance, just to have more a bigger sample of the schools, or do you think this is something that you wouldn't find useful in a research strategy?
Well, specifically for Russia, I think that surveys are overused and more immersive methods are underused, because they take a long time and many resources. So I would say that more in-depth studies are needed, and even if I would develop this study, I would probably conduct observations in other schools, in other localities, but still observations and interviews, because I think that these topics of how you implement the law, or how you are accountable to the state and to the parents, they're really sensitive, and people are not going to answer them honestly in the surveys. And this is also, I think, very much depends on the country context. In some countries, probably people don't feel pressured, or they feel empowered to answer freely whatever they think. But also in post-socialist contexts, it's important to go beyond the official answers, official discourses, because the first answers that you receive, also which I received in the interviews, they were the right answers, which people thought are right to the questions, and only after they have been growing used to me, and they saw that I understand much better what happens in school, and that I'm not judging whether they are good or bad quality, and that I try to take I try to really take their opinion into account rather than impose mine. Then they started to give quite different answers to the same questions.
Yeah.
So I think that immersive methods are more useful to research professionals.
Because you mentioned that because of the fact that you were based in a foreign university, they saw you in the beginning as an external evaluator or as a foreigner. Although in some countries this is an advantage. The fact that you are a foreigner, then you are not as challenging because I don't know, they don't see you as a local actor that maybe is involved in local politics, because it's a foreigner and gives you some legitimacy. But in Russia, this can be a challenge, you consider.
No, I think that you're right, and that in Russia also this position of completely foreign and external person has, in a way, has more opportunities to get sincere answers,
right,
because they know that they have no interest and no opportunity to influence their fate. Also.
Yeah. Okay. And well, I have a final question, because of course your research is academic, but it also has policy implications, and probably there are a lot of lessons to learn from your results, from the conclusions of your work. So if on the basis of your research you had to design or to give some recommendations to the Russian government on how to design an intelligent, a strong quality assurance accountability system that doesn't generate these opportunistic behaviors, or these sometimes not even opportunistic behaviors, but as you say, very superficial responses, what would you recommend to this audience?
That's a great question. It makes me feel very important. If I had this opportunity to give any recommendations, I would probably try to emphasize that you need to respect the teachers, and that for one thing, I wouldn't tie their measurements of students' results to the ideas about the teaching quality. Not even in this value-added manner when the social context is considered, because it still responsibilizes teacher in school too much, and it sort of still undervalues the work that teachers do with low-performance students. So I would not go for any kind of this tying student performance to teachers' salaries or teachers' assessments, their careers, but I would probably create, like Finland does, surveys of student achievement to get the overall picture for the understanding of the students' level in general, but which you could not, even if you want to, you couldn't trace to specific schools and students.
Like sample-based.
Yeah, exactly, sample-based assessments. And I would emphasize the importance of preparing teachers and creating good working conditions for them, and supporting those that work in hard conditions. So that's probably my political position in this aspect.
Someone from the audience wants to, or
You should start with the final statement.
yeah, actually,
Yes.
no, it's fine. No, so as a final statement, I just want to say that this exam corroborates that we're in front of a very strong candidate, and that has done a thorough job. She has addressed all my questions I think that very thoroughly, and I am ready to evaluate the job.
Ladies and gentlemen, I ask those of you who have observations to make on my dissertation presented here to please request the floor from the custos.
Okay, so I declare the doctoral dissertation defense closed.
Dear colleagues and friends, there should be coffee served outside of this room, and I cordially invite you to join.